This story is true. The names are real, the dates are real, the place is still there, sitting quiet on a stretch of Kansas prairie, and you can drive past it today. And the people who lived on that land killed more travelers than anyone was ever able to count, then walked away into the dark and were never seen again. Before I take you back there, let me ask you something. Where are you listening from tonight? Drop it in the comments. The town, the country, the hour on your clock right now. I like knowing who's out there in the quiet with me. Because what I'm about to tell you happened to ordinary people who were just trying to get from one place to another. People not so different from you on the road, looking for somewhere to rest. And if a story like this is the kind of thing that gets under your skin, the kind you want to sink into for a long, slow evening, I made something for you. It's called What the Mountain Keeps. 8 hours of folk horror, no ads. Just one long, immersive descent you can put on with the lights low and let it carry you. The link is in the description, and it's pinned right at the top of the comments. Go save it for later, then come back here, because we've got a long way to go. All right, let me take you to Kansas. The year is 1870. To understand what happened, you have to understand the place, because the place is half the story. After the Civil War, the country was bleeding settlers westward. Soldiers came home to find their old lives didn't fit anymore, and the government was practically begging people to go claim the open land. Southeastern Kansas had just been cleared. The Osage people, who had lived on that ground for generations, were forced south into what would become Oklahoma, and the land they left behind was opened up to homesteaders, 160 acres. That was the promise. Sign the papers, work the soil for a few years, and the land was yours. So they came. Wagon after wagon, families with everything they owned lashed down under canvas, rolling along a thin track called the Osage Mission Trail. The trail ran north and south through Labette County, and it was about as lonely a road as existed in America at the time. You have to picture it. No fences, no towns to speak of. Hours of grass in every direction, moving like water when the wind came through. A man could ride that trail for a full day and pass maybe 2 or 3 houses. The nearest law might be a county over. There was no telegraph in your pocket, no way to call ahead, no way for anyone to know if you'd arrived somewhere or simply stopped. And people stopped all the time. That's the thing nobody outside the frontier quite understood. On the prairie, a person could vanish for the most ordinary reasons. They drowned crossing a swollen creek. They froze in a storm that came up out of nothing. They got sick and died alone in the grass. Or sometimes they just decided they were done with the people back home. And they kept riding, and they started over with a new name and a new place. It happened constantly. A man going missing on that trail in 1871 was sad, but it wasn't strange. That's what made it perfect. Because if you wanted to make people disappear, you could hardly have designed a better place to do it. The frontier did half your work for you. It explained your crimes before anyone even suspected there'd been a crime. And into that emptiness, in the autumn of 1870, came a small group of families who called themselves spiritualists. 5 families by most accounts. Spiritualism was its own kind of movement back then, sweeping through the country in those years after the war. So many people had lost sons, husbands, brothers, and they were desperate, absolutely desperate, to believe the dead weren't really gone. Spiritualists held that the spirit lived on after the body died, and that the right person, a sensitive, a medium, could reach across and speak with them. They held seances. They passed messages. To a grieving nation, it was a comfort, and to some, it was a calling. Most of those families were exactly what they said they were, but one of them was not. They settled on a rise of ground in Osage Township, about 7 miles northeast of a spot that would soon be platted as the town of Cherryvale. And they built a cabin right alongside the trail, in a position any traveler would have to pass. There were 4 of them. The father went by John Bender. He was around 60 years old, broad and heavy, and he spoke almost no English. What little he did speak came out low and broken, so guttural that his own neighbors couldn't make sense of it. Some records even list his first name as William. Nobody was ever quite sure. The mother was called Elvira, though honestly, even her name is uncertain. Different documents give her different ones. She was about 55. She spoke little English too, and she was so cold, so openly unpleasant, that the people around her took to calling her a she-devil. Not as a joke, as a description. Then there was the son, John Bender, Jr. He was around 25, and by every account a good-looking young man, auburn hair, a neat mustache, easy to talk to, charming even. And there was the daughter, Kate. Kate Bender was the one people remembered. She was young, she was striking, and she had something the others didn't. She had charm that filled a room. She presented herself as a healer and a medium, a spiritualist who could speak with the dead and cure the ailments of the living. She gave readings. She held seances. She put advertisements in the local papers offering her services, billing herself as a kind of psychic doctor who could treat blindness, fits, and all manner of suffering that ordinary medicine couldn't reach. And here's the part worth holding on to. We are not even certain these 4 people were a family. That's one of the strangest threads in the whole case, and modern researchers keep tugging at it. The Benders told everyone they were father, mother, son, and daughter. But the people who studied this case the closest, who went into the archives and read the letters and the telegrams, came away convinced it was a lie. The best guess is that Kate and the young man everyone called her brother were not siblings at all. They were most likely a couple, common-law married. And Kate and the older woman were probably mother and daughter for real, 4 people who had stitched themselves into the shape of a family because a family draws less suspicion than 4 strangers sharing a cabin in the middle of nowhere. So even their name, the Benders, the name that would end up in newspapers across the entire country, may not have belonged to any of them. Now, their cabin was a single room, but they divided it. They strung up a heavy canvas wagon cover wall to wall and split the space in 2. The back half they kept for themselves, for sleeping and living. The front half they turned into a little general store with a few shelves of dry goods and a table where a tired traveler could sit down to a hot meal, and a corner where, if the night was bad, a person could sleep before moving on. Out behind the cabin, Elvira and Kate planted a vegetable garden and a small apple orchard. 2 acres or so of turned earth, young trees in neat rows. Remember that orchard. We'll come back to it. For now, just picture the whole thing the way a traveler would have seen it. You've been on the trail for hours. The light is going, the grass is endless, and the cold is coming down, and then, finally, there's a building. Smoke from a chimney. A lamp in the window. A young woman, friendly and warm, telling you to come in out of the wind, there's food, there's a place to lay your head. After a day alone on that prairie, it would have looked like mercy. That was the trap. And I want to be careful here, because I'm not going to dwell on the worst of it. This is a real case, with real victims, and they deserve more than to have the ugliest moments of their lives turned into entertainment. So I'm going to tell you how it worked, but I'm going to tell it the way the survivors told it. Because there were survivors. People who walked into that cabin and felt something was wrong and got out. And they're the reason we know anything at all. Here is what we understand. The table in the front room sat right up against that canvas curtain. And when a guest came in to eat, they were guided, gently but firmly, into a particular seat. The one with your back to the cloth. Kate would sit and talk with you. She was good at it. She'd ask about your journey, your business, where you were headed, how much further you had to go, whether anyone was expecting you. She'd offer a reading. She'd be the most interesting person you'd met in days. And while she held your eyes, there was someone standing on the other side of that curtain. You couldn't see them, but against the pale cloth, from the back, your shape would have been visible, your head leaning forward over your plate. And that's as far as I'll take it. I'll tell you instead about the people who lived. There was a man named William Pickering. He stopped at the Bender place, and he was shown to that seat, and he refused it. Something about the canvas bothered him. There were dark stains on the cloth, and he didn't like the look of them, and he said so, and he asked to move. And the moment he balked, the warmth in that cabin evaporated. Kate came at him with a knife. He didn't argue. He ran, and he kept running, and he lived to tell people what had happened. And there was a Catholic priest, Father Paul Ponzilione, who traveled that country tending to scattered settlers. He stopped at the cabin too, and while he was there, he caught sight of one of the Bender men doing something he couldn't explain, concealing a large hammer, tucking it out of sight. A small thing, but it turned his stomach cold. He made some excuse about needing to see to his horse, and he stepped outside, and he got on that horse and left, and he never went back. A stained curtain, a hidden hammer. 2 people who felt the wrongness in that room and trusted it, and lived because they did. Now think about everyone who didn't, because they didn't all get the warning. They sat where they were told. They leaned over their plates, and the prairie did the rest, the way it always did, swallowing them whole and offering up 100 ordinary explanations for why a man might not arrive where he was going. The first one we can date is from May of 1871. A man named Jones was found in Drum Creek, not far off, with his skull crushed and his throat cut. People suspected a local landowner. Nothing came of it. The frontier shrugged. The next February, 2 more men were found out on the prairie. Same wounds, same silence afterward. And then it just kept happening. Travelers headed through southeastern Kansas to buy land or stock or supplies. Men who tended to be carrying cash, because that's how you did business out there, would set off down the Osage Trail and never reach the other end. And here's the detail that should make the hair stand up on your arms. When their friends and families came looking, they could follow the trail of these missing men right into the big hill country of southeastern Kansas. And then nothing. The trail just stopped. As if these men had ridden into a particular stretch of grass and stepped off the edge of the world. For a while, like I said, nobody connected it. People vanished out there. But by the spring of 1873, it had happened too many times in too small an area, and the country had a long memory for that kind of thing. word started moving from homestead to homestead. Travelers began avoiding the trail altogether, taking longer routes around, because the whisper had gone out that people who went that way didn't always come back. Now, the region already had a bad name. Southeastern Kansas in those years was thick with horse thieves and drifters and men running from something. So when the disappearances started piling up, the local vigilance committees, these self-appointed groups of armed men who passed for law on the frontier, went looking for someone to blame, and they grabbed the usual suspects, drifters, outsiders, men with reputations. They ran innocent people out of the county. They accused and they threatened and they got it wrong over and over. Nobody looked at the friendly family with the little store and the pretty daughter who could talk to the dead. Why would they? Let me pause here for a second, because we're right in the heart of it now, and I want to say two things to you. First, if you've made it this far with me into the cold middle of this thing, then you're exactly the kind of person this channel is for. Beneath Darkness is where we dig into the real cases, the documented ones, the ones with the county records and the old newspaper print and the graves that are actually there. If that's what you came for, do me a favor and hit subscribe so the next one finds you when it drops. And second, I'm honestly curious what you think. Because we've reached the point in this story where you have to start asking what kind of people do this, not in a fit of rage, not once, but methodically, over 2 years, to stranger after stranger, while serving them dinner and offering to read their fortunes. Do you think there's a rational explanation for the benders? Greed, plain and simple, 4 cold people who found an easy way to take money off travelers. Or do you think there was something else in that cabin, something the word greed doesn't quite cover? Tell me in the comments. I read them. I want to know where you land on this before you hear how it ends, because how it ends is the strangest part. In the winter of 1872, a man named George Newton Longcore set out from Independence, Kansas. He was a settler, like so many of them, looking to start over somewhere new. He was headed for Iowa. He wasn't traveling alone. He had his young daughter with him. And I'll tell you plainly, this is the part of the case I'm going to handle gently and then move past, out of respect. The Longcores never made it to Iowa. They never reached anywhere. The man and his little girl simply dropped out of the world on that road, the way so many had before them, and at the time, no one knew why. But this disappearance was different from the others, because George Longcore had a friend, a neighbor back in Independence, and that friend was not the kind of man the prairie could quietly erase. His name was Dr. William York. Dr. York was a physician, well known and well respected in Independence. He'd served in the Civil War, and he was bothered, deeply bothered, by what had happened to his friend Longcore and the child. So in the early spring of 1873, he started asking questions. He traveled up to Fort Scott, looking into it, trying to retrace where they'd gone. And on his way back home, down the Osage Trail, Dr. William York disappeared too. Now the prairie had made a mistake, because Dr. York had 2 brothers, and they were not men who would accept a shrug and a vague story about how people just vanish out here. One brother, Ed, lived in Fort Scott. The other was a man named Colonel Alexander York, and Colonel York was a problem. He was a Civil War veteran, he was a lawyer, and he was a sitting member of the Kansas State Senate. He had standing, he had resources, and he had the kind of stubbornness that doesn't let go. When his brother didn't come home, Colonel York didn't write a letter and wait. He raised a company of men, by some accounts dozens of them, armed and organized, and he went out onto that trail himself, and he started knocking on every door in the county. He questioned travelers, he visited homestead after homestead. He retraced his brother's route mile by mile, and the route led him, as it had to a little cabin and store about 7 miles from Cherryvale, the Bender place. Colonel York arrived there in late March of 1873 with another man. He was polite. He explained that his brother, the doctor, had gone missing and asked whether they'd seen him, and the Benders didn't deny it. That's what's so chilling about it. They told the colonel yes, the doctor had stopped there. He'd had a meal, but he'd left, they said, alive and well and gone on his way. And then they offered him a theory, the same one the frontier always offered. Maybe, they suggested, the doctor had run into trouble with the native people in the area. Maybe that's what became of him. Colonel York considered it. It was plausible. It was, after all, exactly the kind of thing that explained so many disappearances. He didn't have enough to accuse anyone, and so, incredibly, he stayed for dinner, in that cabin, at that table, and he left alive. We'll never know exactly why they didn't try anything with him. Maybe because he came with armed men. Maybe because a state senator was too big to make disappear. Whatever the reason, Colonel York rode away that day having sat in the very room where his brother was killed, having broken bread with the people who did it and not knowing. But something gnawed at him. He went back. Early in April, he returned to the cabin, this time with armed men at his side, because he'd been hearing things. He'd heard about a woman who'd fled the Bender place after Elvira came at her with knives. He'd heard the rumors that were thick in the county by then. And on one of these visits, as the story goes, Kate did something almost unbelievable in its nerve. She offered to help him. She told Colonel York that for a price she could use her gifts, her clairvoyance, to locate his missing brother. The medium offered to summon the spirit of the man her own household had murdered and charge the grieving brother for the seance. That's the kind of cold we're talking about. Colonel York didn't take her up on it, but by now his suspicion had hardened into something close to certainty, even if he couldn't prove it, and he wasn't the only one. The whole township was uneasy, the disappearances, the rumors, the slander flying between neighbors as everyone accused everyone else. It had become unbearable. So they called a meeting. The men of Osage Township gathered, with Colonel York among them and a township official named Leroy Dick helping to lead, and they made a decision. They would obtain warrants, and they would search every single homestead in the area, every cabin, every barn, no exceptions, so that no one could say they'd been singled out. They would simply go down the trail, house by house, and look. The Bender cabin was on that list. It was a sound plan. It was the right plan. And it came about a day too late, because the Benders were listening. We don't know exactly how they learned what was coming. In a community that small, with that much talk, it wouldn't have taken much. But somehow, the night that decision was made, the Benders understood that the searchers were finally going to come for them. And they ran. There was no dramatic confrontation, no siege, no shootout, no arrest. The most wanted family in the coming history of the American frontier simply packed what they could carry, and in the dark, they left. They didn't even take the animals. That's one of the details that stays with me. When people finally came to that cabin, the livestock were still there, untended, hungry, milling around a house with no one in it. The Benders had left their stock to starve. They'd left the lamps and the shelves and the table. They'd left in such a hurry, or with such cold practicality, that they took only themselves and their money and disappeared down the trail in a wagon, headed for the railroad, gone. For a few days, nobody even realized. And then, in May of 1873, a search party came up the trail to the Bender place. Expecting to question the family like all the others, they found a dead house, no smoke, no lamp, the animals wandering loose and wretched, the door open to an empty room, and as they stepped inside, before they understood anything else, they understood the smell. I won't describe it beyond this. Everyone who was there said the same thing. It was the smell of death, heavy and unmistakable, soaked into that little cabin, and it told them everything before they found a single thing with their eyes. They pulled back the canvas curtain, the one travelers had been seated against, and behind it, set into the floor, they found a trapdoor. It opened onto a shallow cellar, and the cellar was where the smell was coming from. The ground beneath that house was dark and stained, and it was clear, immediately and horribly clear, that terrible things had happened in that hole, again and again for a long time. But the cellar was empty of bodies. The Benders hadn't kept them there. They'd done their hiding outside. So the searchers went out back, to the garden, to the orchard, to those 2 acres of turned earth and young apple trees, and they began to dig. I'm going to tell you what they found. But I'm going to tell you the way the newspapers of the time eventually told it, because even hardened frontier reporters who printed everything, ran up against the limits of what could be said. One paper, the Emporia News, wrote that it had been impossible to get more than an outline of the terrible deeds, and that no person could describe the horribleness of what was found. When the press of 1873 tells you they can't find the words, you understand you've reached something that doesn't need spelling out. So here is the outline, and only the outline. Grave after grave in the orchard. The diggers would find disturbed soil, and they would dig, and they would find someone, and then they'd find another patch, and dig and find someone else. The first one they uncovered was the man they'd come looking for all along, Dr. William York. Buried in the ground behind the cabin he'd eaten his last meal in. By the time they were done, they had recovered the remains of at least 8 people, and by most accounts closer to 11, pulled from that small patch of earth. And there were additional remains that didn't seem to belong to any of the others, which told investigators the real number was higher, possibly far higher. Some researchers, weighing everything found on and around that property, have put the total at 20 or more. Among the dead were Dr. York and the man Longcore, the settler who had been bound for Iowa. And I'll say it once and leave it, his young daughter was among them too. The county wept for that child, and I'll let that be enough, and I'll move on. Because she was a real little girl and not a plot point, and the kindest thing I can do is not linger. The press named the place almost immediately Hell's Half Acre, the Devil's Kitchen. The story tore across the entire country within days. You have to understand how shocking this was to people at the time. America in 1873 had a picture in its head of what a murderer looked like. A lone, desperate man, a road agent, a drunk. What it could not comprehend was a family. A mother and a father, a son and a daughter, sitting down together dividing up the work, one charming the guest while another waited behind the curtain, all of them in on it, all of them washing the dishes afterward. The idea of a household organized around this, with a young woman as its smiling public face, broke something in the national imagination. It was newer and stranger and worse than anything the dime novels had dreamed up. And the response, the very human, very stupid response, was that people came to see it. They flocked to the Bender property. Sightseers, by the wagon load, treating a mass grave like an attraction. And they didn't just look, they took. People pulled the cabin apart with their bare hands for souvenirs, board by board, brick by brick, until the building where it all happened was simply gone, carried off in pieces by strangers who wanted a relic of the horror to put on a shelf. Whatever evidence that cabin still held, whatever might have helped catch the people who built it, was scattered to the four winds by tourists. So now there was a nationwide sensation, a stack of bodies, a country baying for justice, and no Benders. They had a head start of nearly a month before anyone even started chasing in earnest, and the chase, when it came, was a mess. The governor of Kansas, Thomas Osborne, moved fast to look decisive. He backed a reward for the capture of the Benders, and between the state's money and private offers, the total climbed to around $2,000. That was an enormous sum for the time, a small fortune. Wanted notices went out. Pauses formed and spread along the likely escape routes, hungry for the money and boiling with outrage. Colonel York hired a detective, a man named Thomas Beers, to track them. The township trustee, Leroy Dick, the same man who'd helped organize the search, threw himself into piecing the case together and chasing leads. But think about what they were actually working with. This was 1873. There were no photographs of the Benders. Not one. To this very day, no authentic photograph of any of the four is known to exist. Everything you've ever seen that claims to show their faces, the grim little portraits in the old books, those were sketches, drawn later from the memories of neighbors and travelers describing four people with fairly ordinary features. There were no fingerprints. The science didn't exist. There were no centralized criminal records, no way to flash a description across the country in an instant. The Benders had ridden to a railroad and boarded a train, and once a person stepped onto a train in 1873 and got off in a city somewhere with a new name, they were, for all practical purposes, smoke. The lawmen chased reports for years. There were sightings everywhere and nowhere. A family matching their description seen here, four travelers acting strange seen there. Every lead dissolved when you got close to it. The posses came back empty. The detective came back empty. The reward went unclaimed. The bloody Benders, as the papers had named them, were simply gone. And this is where the case stops being a manhunt and becomes something stranger, because in the absence of an ending, people built their own. Over the decades that followed, the question of what happened to the Benders grew into one of the great American mysteries, and at least three very different answers took root. The first answer is the simplest. They got away. They reached the railroad, they scattered into the vast anonymous country, and they lived out their lives somewhere under other names, having gotten away with everything. No justice, no reckoning, just four murderers growing old in some town that never knew what they'd done. It's the most likely answer, honestly. It's also the most unbearable one, which is probably why so many people refuse to accept it. The second answer is the one the frontier liked better. Because there was always a whisper running underneath the official story that the Benders never made it far at all, that a group of men, vigilantes, caught up with that wagon and dealt with the family their own way, out on the prairie where no court would ever ask about it, and then buried them and divided up the stolen money and swore an oath to one another never to speak of it again. And the strange thing about this whisper is that, years later, men started confessing to it, on their deathbeds. Around the turn of the century and after, more than one dying man told the people gathered around him that he had been there, that he'd ridden with the party that ran down the Benders. One man, dying in a New Mexico cow camp around 1910, described it in detail to the cowmen around him. He said they'd caught the four of them and decided among themselves that it had been an execution without a trial, and that what they'd done might rightly be called murder. And so they buried the bodies and erased every trace of the digging. He said they'd found several $1,000s on the Benders and split it, and he said that before they rode away, they'd stood bareheaded with their hands raised and sworn to God and to one another never to tell. He asked, with his last breath, that his confession be carried back to Kansas. There were others. An anonymous letter printed in Pennsylvania back in 1880, claiming the writer had witnessed the executions, other dying men in other places, telling the same shape of story. Are they true? Nobody knows. Deathbed confessions are notoriously slippery. A dying man can claim a piece of the most famous crime in the country, and who's going to argue with him? But there were enough of them, scattered across enough years and enough states, that the theory never died. And there's an old story tied to it that I love, even though historians fight about it. A little girl grew up near that part of Kansas in those years. Her name was Laura Ingalls. Yes, that Laura Ingalls, who grew up to write the Little House books. She claimed in later life that her family had lived near the Benders, that her own father had ridden out with the vigilantes who went hunting for them, and that whenever the subject came up afterward, her pa would say in a strange flat voice that the Benders would never be found. And she wrote that she formed her own conclusions about why. Now, the timeline doesn't quite work. Scholars point out the Ingalls family had likely moved on before the case broke, and Laura would have been very small, so take it as legend, not testimony. But it's the kind of legend that grows on a case like this. The kind where a famous name leans in and says, in effect, oh, them? They were dealt with. We just don't talk about it. And then there's the third answer, the trial. In November of 1889, 16 years after the Benders vanished, 2 women were arrested up in Michigan, and the country lost its mind because it looked, for one electric moment, like half the Bender family had finally fallen into the law's hands. The women were Elmira Griffith and her daughter Sarah Eliza Davis. And what makes this part remarkable is who tracked them down. It wasn't a famous detective, it was a woman named Frances McCann, who was herself the daughter of one of the Benders' victims. She had spent years convinced she could find the killers, and her detective work led the authorities to these 2 women who bore, people said, a striking resemblance to Elvira and Kate. They were brought back to Kansas to stand trial for the murder of Dr. York. Leroy Dick, the old township trustee who'd seen the Benders with his own eyes back in the 70s, was called to identify them. And for a little while, it seemed like the story might finally close. But at a preliminary hearing to settle their identities, the whole thing came apart. The defense had a sharp lawyer, a man named John T. James, and he picked the case to pieces. There were problems. The older woman spoke clear English with no accent, and everyone agreed Elvira Bender had barely been able to speak English at all. Witnesses contradicted one another. Evidence emerged placing the women elsewhere during the murders. The 2 of them may well have been criminals and liars. Their own lawyer admitted as much, but the case that they were the Benders simply would not hold. The prosecutor moved to dismiss, and the women walked free. There's a quieter, more cynical reading of that ending, too, that some researchers favor. The key affidavits and papers that might have settled the matter went missing from the county file. And it's been suggested that Labette County, frankly, didn't want to pay to keep boarding and trying 2 women on a shaky case for the months it would take. So maybe it wasn't only that the evidence was weak, maybe it was also that nobody by then had the appetite or the money to chase a 16-year-old ghost. And that's the thread that runs through this entire case all the way down. The records are gone. The affidavits, the papers, so much of the official file from Labette County missing. Lost to time or to disinterest or to someone who wanted them gone. The cabin was torn to splinters by souvenir hunters. There were never any photographs of the family to begin with. The bodies of the victims, most of them never even identified, were eventually gathered up and reburied at the base of a small hill about a mile from the orchard, a spot that came to be known, quietly, as the Benders Mounds. And the people who might have known the truth carried it into their own graves, some of them whispering pieces of it on the way down, none of them whispering enough. For years, the state of Kansas marked the site with a historical sign out along the highway north of Cherryvale, and the original version of that sign ended with a single honest line. The end of the Benders is not known, not solved, not closed, not known. And for more than a century, that's exactly where the story sat. A dead house torn apart, an orchard full of graves, a family that walked off the edge of the record and was never seen again, and a green Kansas field where nothing was left to see. Except, here's why I wanted to tell you this one now, tonight, instead of any of the 100 other dark stories I could have told. Because the field is being dug up again, right now, in our own time. A few years back, the land where the Bender cabin stood was bought by a local man named Bob Miller. He grew up around there, fascinated since he was a kid by this bloody piece of his home county's history. And Miller didn't want the land to just sit there as featureless farm ground forever with the worst of its secrets still buried. He wanted answers. He wanted to know where the cabin had actually stood, where the cellar had been, where the graves were, and he wanted something more than that. Some of the Benders' victims were never identified. They went into the ground as nameless men more than 150 years ago. And Miller had a thought that the 1870s could never have managed. If you could find even a few bones, even a few teeth, you might be able to pull DNA from them and match those nameless victims to living descendants, and finally give some of them their names back. So he brought in scientists. Over recent summers, a team from the University of Kansas, archaeologists and students from the anthropology department, has been out on that land, doing what the searchers of 1873 never could. They started with remote sensing, using instruments to read the soil and find the anomalies hidden beneath the surface, mapping the buried disturbances where structures and pits once were. A researcher from the Kansas Geological Survey led that first effort. Then, an anthropology professor named Lauren Norman led field schools that began carefully excavating those anomalies, one square at a time. And they've been finding things, around 1,200 artifacts by recent counts. Broken pieces of tableware, shattered glass from windows and bottles, wagon parts, the nails and hardware that once held a cabin together. Ordinary objects, the litter of frontier life, each one recorded with its exact location, lifted out, cleaned, cataloged, photographed, studied. The professor running it has said something I keep thinking about, that the artifacts themselves are only a fraction of what they're after. What they really want is the layout. Where was the house? Where was the barn? Where were the graves? And the work isn't finished. The team has been returning summer after summer, and they plan to keep coming back. Which means that as you and I sit here in the dark with this story, there's a real possibility that out on that quiet Kansas prairie, people with trowels and screens and brushes are kneeling in the dirt over the place where it all happened, lifting the past up out of the ground a handful at a time, trying to coax one more secret out of a family that has kept its secrets for more than a century and a half. Maybe they find the cellar. Maybe they find the orchard graves the diggers of 1873 missed. Maybe, someday, a tooth or a fragment of bone gives one of those nameless travelers their name back, and somewhere a living family learns at last what became of an ancestor who rode down a trail in Kansas one evening and was never heard from again. Or maybe the ground keeps what it's kept all along. That's the thing about a case like this. It was never really solved. It was just buried, by time and by tourists and by missing paperwork and by men who swore an oath in the dark. And every generation since has stood at the edge of that field and wondered the same thing. What happened to the Benders? We don't know. The end of the Benders is not known. Before I let you go, 2 quick things. If this kind of story is your kind of story, the slow build, the cold dread, the thing in the dark that never quite resolves, then go put on What the Mountain Keeps. It's 8 hours of folk horror, no ads, one long, immersive listen made for exactly the mood you're in right now. The link's in the description and pinned at the very top of the comments. Save it. Put it on tonight when this video ends and you're not ready to turn the lights back up. And then tell me, what do you think really happened to the Bender family? Did they vanish into the country and grow old and die free, having gotten away with all of it? Or did a wagon get run down on a dark prairie, and a hole get dug, and an oath get sworn? Drop your theory in the comments. I read every one of them, and the best ones genuinely change how I think about these cases. And if you know another story like this, a real one, with the records and the graves and the questions nobody can answer, send it to me. It might be the next one we sit down with in the dark. Until then, stay out of strange houses on lonely roads, and be careful who you let seat you with your back to the curtain.